9 sins that can be more terrible than mortal sins. One of them is more terrible than the other. These sins can leave a trace in the soul, change the fate, and affect the life of not only an individual, but the whole society. But we will tell about it at the end. Indifference. In the Christian context, indifference is considered a sin because it manifests itself in indifference to what God considers important. It can manifest itself in indifference to the needs and suffering of others, which is contrary to the Christian call to love and compassion. The Bible urges believers not to be slothful in zeal and to be fervent in spirit, which implies active participation in society and caring for one's neighbors. Indifference has a significant impact on society because it can lead to the normalization of suffering and injustice. When people become indifferent to the misfortunes of others, it increases feelings of loneliness and alienation in those affected and contributes to the continuation of the cycle of suffering and inequality. Indifference can lead to important social issues going unaddressed, which in turn can exacerbate inequality and injustice in society. Avoiding indifference is important because every person has value and is worthy of respect and care. Christianity teaches that love and compassion for others is not just a moral quality, but a path to a more just and harmonious society. Cruelty. In Christianity, cruelty is considered a sin because it goes against the basic biblical principles of love, compassion, and justice. Cruelty leads to suffering and destruction, which is the opposite of the pursuit of peace and well-being that Christianity encourages. Cruelty creates fear, distrust, and division in society. It can lead to social isolation, psychological trauma, and even physical violence, which destroys the fabric of society and undermines its stability. Avoiding cruelty contributes to a more harmonious and just society. When people show kindness and care for each other, it promotes social cohesion and general well-being. Alienation from family, society, and loved ones. Alienation is considered a sin in a Christian context because it goes against the biblical teachings of love, forgiveness, and community. Christianity calls for unity, support, and compassion between people, and alienation breaks these bonds and leads to loneliness and suffering. St. John Chrysostom asserted that he who does not love his brother is unable to love God. This emphasizes that love of neighbor is an integral part of the Christian faith. Colossians 3:13. Be gracious to one another and forgive one another. If anyone has a complaint against anyone, just as Christ has forgiven you, so you also forgive. Alienation is opposed to these teachings because it leads to the destruction of the fellowship that is the foundation of the Christian faith. Instead, Christians are called to understand, forgive, and support one another in order to build a more just and loving society. Envy is considered one of the 7 deadly sins and is seen as particularly dangerous because it can lead to other sins and distance a person from God. Envy is described as sadness or bitterness over the good of one's neighbor and a desire to possess what is given to another. This is contrary to Christian teachings about loving one's neighbor and being grateful for what is given from God. Envy can lead to judgment, anger, grumbling, and even murder, as in the case of Cain and Abel from the Old Testament. Therefore, fighting and overcoming envy is considered important for spiritual development and maintaining a relationship with God. Avoiding envy is necessary in order not to give in to negative emotions and not to stray from the path of faith and love that Christianity preaches. Vanity is considered a major sin in Christianity because it can lead to rejection of God and self-confidence in one's own abilities. It is a type of self-idolatry where a person begins to rely only on himself, rejecting the need for God's help. This state of mind can give rise to other sins and alienate a person from divine grace. In the Christian tradition, vanity is seen as a dangerous sin because it destroys humility, which is a key quality of the believer. Vanity can lead to pride, selfishness, and contempt, which makes a person a slave to the passions rather than a servant of God. Therefore, combating vanity is the way to develop spiritually and maintain humility before God and people. It is important to avoid vanity in order not to lose contact with God and not to become a victim of one's own conceit and pride. Humility and repentance help to overcome this sin and lead a life filled with God's grace. Pride is considered one of the 7 deadly sins in Christianity and is particularly dangerous because it is opposed to humility, which is one of the basic Christian virtues. Pride leads to self-aggrandizement and refusal to recognize one's mistakes and dependence on God. In the Orthodox tradition, pride is seen as a spiritual disease that alienates man from God and grace, making him permissive, arrogant, and presumptuous. A proud person strives for worldly success and material goods, forgetting about spiritual development and the need for humility before God. Avoiding pride is necessary to keep spiritual connection with God and not to become a victim of one's ego. Repentance and prayer help to overcome pride and lead a life filled with love and compassion, which are the antithesis of pride. In Christianity, Greed is considered one of the deadly sins that can have serious consequences for the soul. Here's why. Rejection of God. Greed is the desire to accumulate material goods and wealth, often at the expense of spiritual values. When a person becomes overly attached to worldly things, they can reject God and forget about the spiritual aspects of life. Ownership. Greed leads to a possessive attitude toward things. The person begins to believe that everything belongs to him and is unwilling to share with others. This is contrary to the Christian teaching of generosity and unselfishness. Alienation. Greed makes a person selfish and unable to see the needs of others. He may become indifferent to the suffering of his neighbors and unwilling to help them, causing other sins. Greed can be the source of other sins, such as cheating, stealing, envy, and covetousness. It destroys spiritual balance and leads to spiritual emptiness. Avoiding greed is important for spiritual health. Christians call for generosity, humility, and unselfishness. Repentance and awareness of one's mistakes helps one overcome this sin and follow the path set forth by Jesus Christ. Violence is considered one of the serious sins because it contradicts the basic teaching of love and mercy. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, mortal sin destroys love in the human heart by a grave violation of the law of God. It turns man away from God, who is his ultimate goal and his bliss, causing him to prefer some inferior good to God. Violence, especially when it harms others, is a serious violation of Christian commandments, such as the commandment not to kill and to love one's neighbor as oneself. Avoiding violence is important because it leads to the destruction of human relationships and alienates people from God. The Christian tradition emphasizes the value of every human life and the importance of forgiveness and reconciliation instead of revenge and violence. Therefore, believers are called to avoid violence and to seek peace and harmony in their relationships with others. Offense against nature. In the Christian tradition, offenses against nature are often regarded as serious sins because they violate the natural order established by God. Orthodoxy, for example, defines sin as a voluntary departure from what is according to nature into what is unnatural, contranatural. This can include actions that harm the environment, animals, or man himself. From a Christian perspective, man is created in the image of God and should live in harmony with the created world. Crimes against nature can be seen as a violation of this harmony and a deviation from the divine plan for humanity. Such actions may include destruction of ecosystems, cruelty to animals, or other forms of exploitation of natural resources that do not consider the long-term consequences for the planet and its inhabitants. It is important to note that Christian ethics places great emphasis not only on avoiding sin, but also on active participation in caring for the created world, which includes responsible stewardship of nature and all living things. This is seen as part of the Christian's broader mission to love and protect all of creation.